It was the dawn of a new year, January 5th, 1942. The streets of Tokyo roared with the sound of victory. But behind those celebrations, one man sat in silence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, stared at the map before him. His nation had conquered half the Pacific in just weeks, yet he knew the storm had only begun. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories from history's greatest wars and the people who shaped them. In the early days of 1942, Japan stood at the height of its power. Its armies had swept through Malaya, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, defeating enemy forces with stunning speed. To the Japanese people, victory felt unstoppable. Destiny itself seemed to guide their empire's hand. But Yamamoto saw something different. Where others saw glory, he saw a clock ticking. He knew these victories had awakened a sleeping giant, the United States of America. Months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had warned Japan's leaders, "For 6 months after the war begins, I will run wild. But after that, I cannot promise success." His words were not arrogance, they were prophecy. Within Japan's high command, a fierce debate raged. Nationalist generals wanted to keep pushing outward, Australia, India, even the Middle East. They dreamed of an empire that would stretch from Tokyo to Tehran. But Yamamoto, ever the realist, urged caution. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood the industrial might and the willpower of the American people. If Japan didn't secure peace quickly, he believed, it would be crushed under the weight of its own ambition. Even his own colleagues feared his honesty. In Tokyo, whispers spread that Yamamoto might be assassinated for his opposition to an endless war. To protect him, his friends arranged for him to remain at sea aboard the Yamato, Japan's colossal flagship. Months earlier, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, head of a powerful nationalist group. Over tea at the Imperial Navy Club, Yamamoto's voice was low but firm. "War is inevitable," he said, "but once it begins, our victories will spread quickly, like an octopus stretching its arms across the sea. Yet remember, Sasakawa, the octopus can only stretch so far before it flattens." He believed Japan would have, at best, a year and a half of dominance. Within that window, the empire had to secure peace or face destruction. The triumph of Pearl Harbor had shocked the world. American battleships burned in the harbor. The British fleet lay sunk off Malaya. Hong Kong had fallen. Manila had been captured. To the world, Japan looked unstoppable. But to Yamamoto, something was missing: the American aircraft carriers. They had escaped destruction, and their survival haunted him. Without neutralizing them, Japan's supremacy was fragile, built on borrowed time. So Yamamoto began to plan again. If the first strike had been Pearl Harbor, the second would have to be even more decisive, something so bold it would cripple American morale and force a peace negotiation. The Imperial General Staff debated fiercely. Some wanted to invade Australia, cutting off the US and Britain from the Pacific. Others urged an attack on India to link up with German forces pressing through the Middle East. Yamamoto, however, had another vision. He wanted to strike deep into the heart of the Pacific, at Midway Island. Destroying America's remaining carriers there, he believed, would shatter their naval strength once and for all. And if all went according to plan, Japan could then seize Hawaii and perhaps even reach the western coast of the United States. By early 1942, plans were drafted. Operation MI for the attack on Midway, and Operation AL for the invasion of Alaska's Aleutian Islands. It was a daring gamble, but Yamamoto was no stranger to risk. As news of victory poured in from the south, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese public rejoiced. But Yamamoto remained cautious. To him, every new conquest was another weight added to a fragile tower. He warned his officers, "We cannot fight the Western powers and hope to win in the long run. The time to talk peace is when our victories still echo." But peace would not come. The political leaders in Tokyo wanted more land, more glory, more war. And soon, a raid from across the Pacific would prove that Yamamoto's fears were not misplaced. As Tokyo celebrated, a small squadron of American bombers lifted off from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, heading straight for Japan's heart. The age of easy victories was about to end. April 18, 1942. The skies above Japan roared with the thunder of engines, but they were not Japanese. 16 American B-25 bombers streaked toward Tokyo, dropping bombs that shattered not the city, but the illusion of Japanese invincibility. For the first time since the war began, the enemy had struck the Japanese homeland. And for Admiral Yamamoto, it was the beginning of his greatest fear. This is part 2 of our war story. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of courage, strategy, and sacrifice from the battlefields of history. The Doolittle Raid was more psychological than strategic. The bomb damage was light, a few factories, a few homes. But the emotional impact on Japan was enormous. The people who had celebrated endless victories now stared in disbelief as their capital burned. For the first time, they realized the war could come home. At Imperial headquarters, Yamamoto received the news in silence. He understood what this meant. The Americans were not defeated, they were awakening. He knew now that the United States would fight with vengeance, not fear. Tokyo's generals raged for revenge. The Doolittle Raid had humiliated them, and they demanded action. But Yamamoto saw an opportunity within the disaster, a way to finally lure the American fleet into a trap. Yamamoto's mind turned to Midway Island, a small but vital outpost in the Pacific. He reasoned that if Japan could seize it, the U.S. Navy would have no choice to respond. There, in one decisive battle, Japan could destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers and secure total control of the Pacific. The plan was grand, almost poetic in its ambition, but it was also dangerously complex. It required the coordination of 4 carrier groups, invasion forces, and diversionary attacks stretching from the Aleutians in the north to Midway in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto believed Japan's intelligence and secrecy would ensure victory. But what he didn't know was that the Americans had already broken parts of the Japanese naval code. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his cryptographers had intercepted enough messages to guess where the next attack would fall. And so, as Japan prepared for its masterpiece, the Americans were already waiting. June 4, 1942, dawn broke over the Pacific like a promise of destiny. Japanese carrier planes screamed toward Midway, bombing the island's defenses. At first, it seemed like another flawless operation. But high above the clouds, American planes were closing in. They had been waiting for hours, guided by radar and fate itself. When they struck, it was sudden, brutal, and complete. In just minutes, 3 of Japan's great carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, managed to launch one final counterattack before she too was destroyed. By sunset, 4 of Japan's prized fleet carriers were gone, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew. The same men who had attacked Pearl Harbor were now dead or missing. For Yamamoto, who had watched his brilliant plan collapse from afar, the shock was devastating. He had promised the emperor that Midway would end the war swiftly. Instead, it marked the moment Japan's fate began to reverse. When reports of the defeat reached Tokyo, they were carefully censored. Only the highest officials knew the truth, that Japan's naval strength had been shattered in a single day. Publicly, the government spoke of victory. Privately, Yamamoto's heart sank. The tide had turned. The Doolittle Raid had exposed Japan's vulnerability. The Battle of Midway had destroyed its offensive power. Now Yamamoto could no longer dictate the rhythm of war. He could only react. But even as Japan licked its wounds, its generals still dreamed of conquest. They turned their eyes southward, to New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and beyond. There they hoped to build a new defensive line and perhaps regain the momentum they had lost at Midway. By mid-1942, the Pacific was burning. Bombers had struck Darwin in northern Australia. Troops were advancing through New Guinea, threatening to cut off the continent. In Australia, General Douglas MacArthur, newly arrived from the Philippines, warned that invasion was imminent. He pleaded for reinforcements, carriers, planes, and men. But Washington had little to spare. America's fleet was still rebuilding from its wounds. Across the ocean, Admiral Ernest King, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, faced an impossible choice: protect the Pacific or focus on Europe. He knew Japan had to be stopped before it reached Australia, and so he approved a bold new plan, one that would mark the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. Its target, a small, jungle-covered island few Americans had ever heard of. Its name was Guadalcanal. While Tokyo mourned its sunken carriers, the Americans were preparing for their first great strike back. An island of mud, rain, and blood awaited them, where thousands would fight not for victory, but for survival. August 7th, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Islands, and with it, the silence of the Pacific is shattered. From the decks of American warships, thousands of Marines gaze toward a jungle-covered island. Their mission? To strike back, for Pearl Harbor, for Midway, for every loss the Pacific had witnessed. The name of that island would soon echo through history: Guadalcanal. After the disaster at Midway, American leaders saw an opening, small but vital. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, a position that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. If that base were completed, Japan could control the entire South Pacific. To stop it, the U.S. launched Operation Watchtower, the first American amphibious assault of World War II. It was bold, rushed, and risky. No one knew if it would succeed, but Admiral Ernest King insisted, "We must act, even if we're not ready." As the first rays of sunlight touched the ocean, the American fleet opened fire. Cruisers and destroyers unleashed a thunderous bombardment on the island shores. At exactly 9 a.m., landing craft churned through the surf, carrying the men of the 1st Marine Division. The Marines expected fierce resistance. Instead, silence. The Japanese laborers building the airfield had fled into the jungle, abandoning half-eaten meals and half-burned fires. The Americans advanced cautiously through the palm trees, rifles raised, expecting an ambush. But none came. By afternoon, the Marines had captured the unfinished airstrip, later named Henderson Field after a pilot killed at Midway. The landing seemed too easy, too quiet. Veterans of later battles would look back and call it the calm before hell. While the landings on Guadalcanal went smoothly, across the channel, 3 smaller islands told a different story. At Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, Japanese troops fought with ferocious, almost suicidal determination. Marine Colonel Merritt Red Edson led the assault. His raiders, hand-picked, battle-hardened, and fearless, stormed the beaches under a hail of machine gun fire. The Japanese had dug deep into caves and ridges, refusing to surrender. Grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets turned the lush jungle into a nightmare. Each bunker had to be taken by hand, each cave cleared one explosion at a time. At night, the Japanese counterattacked with chilling screams, charging through the darkness. Their fanaticism stunned the Marines. For many Americans, this was their first face-to-face encounter with the Imperial Japanese Army. By the end of the second day, Tulagi and its neighboring islets were secured, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of Japanese lay dead. Only a handful surrendered. The Americans began to understand this enemy would never quit, even in death. As the Marines dug in on Guadalcanal, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher kept his carriers offshore, providing air cover. But he was nervous. His fleet was vulnerable, and his orders vague. On August 8th, after just 2 days, Fletcher made a fateful decision to withdraw his carriers. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the invasion fleet, was stunned. Without air support, the Marines were exposed to Japanese bombers from Rabaul, only a few hundred miles away. And sure enough, by afternoon, the sky filled with the roar of engines. Japanese Betty bombers descended on the American fleet like a swarm. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, tracer fire cutting through the clouds. Dozens of Japanese planes were shot down, but some got through. A transport ship and a destroyer were hit and set ablaze. That night, as darkness fell, Turner's ships lay anchored, vulnerable, their decks glistening under a pale moon. They didn't know it yet, but a Japanese strike force was already closing in. Just past midnight on August 9th, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a powerful Japanese cruiser force south through a narrow passage known as the Slot. His goal? Destroy the Allied fleet guarding Guadalcanal. In the darkness, radarless and unprepared, the Americans never saw them coming. At 1:43 a.m., searchlights flared across the water, and hell opened up. Japanese heavy cruisers fired deadly broadsides into the Allied ships at point-blank range. Shells ripped through steel hulls. The sea glowed red as fuel ignited and men screamed in the water. In less than an hour, the Allies lost 4 cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Astoria, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra. Over 1,000 sailors died in one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. But the Japanese, fearing American air retaliation at dawn, withdrew before finishing off the transports. Their retreat saved the Marines on Guadalcanal from total isolation. When the sun rose on August 9th, the American Marines realized their supply ships were gone. No air cover, no naval support. Just 11,000 men stranded on a hostile island, facing an enemy that would soon strike back. General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the Marines, ordered his men to fortify Henderson Field. They dug trenches, built defenses from palm logs, and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. They didn't have to wait long. From Rabaul, fresh Japanese troops were already on their way, and soon the battle for Guadalcanal would descend into one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire Pacific War. The Americans had landed, but the real war had only just begun. Cut off, outnumbered, and outgunned, the Marines of Guadalcanal would face weeks of terror in the jungle as the Japanese returned with a vengeance. August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal. Rain poured over the jungle like a curtain of steel. In the dark, thousands of Japanese soldiers crept through the mud toward Henderson Field, their rifles wrapped in cloth, bayonets fixed. They believed victory was certain. But what awaited them in the jungle was not fear, it was fury. The battle for Guadalcanal had begun in blood. Welcome to part 4 of our story. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more gripping stories from the front lines of history. After the American invasion, the Japanese High Command refused to accept defeat. The loss of Guadalcanal would threaten their entire southern campaign, and so reinforcements were dispatched immediately. Soldiers of the elite Ichiki detachment, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a proud and ruthless officer. Ichiki's orders were clear: retake the airfield, destroy the Americans, leave no survivors. On the other side of the island, General Alexander Vandegrift knew the Japanese would strike soon. His Marines were exhausted, short on food and ammunition, but they had something the Japanese didn't: Henderson Field. If they could hold that airstrip, they could control the skies and the future of the Pacific. Just before dawn on August 21st, Ichiki's men emerged from the jungle near the Tanaru River, believing they would sweep aside a weak enemy. They were wrong. Waiting behind sandbagged positions and barbed wire, the Marines had set up a deadly trap. As the Japanese charged across the river, shouting battle cries, machine guns opened fire. The sound tore through the darkness, a wall of bullets cutting down men by the hundreds. For hours, the battle raged. When the Japanese tried to cross again, they were met by artillery and flamethrowers. By morning, the beach was littered with bodies. Of the nearly 900 men in Ichiki's unit, fewer than 100 escaped. The colonel himself committed suicide beside the river. The victory at Tanaru was America's first major land triumph against the Japanese, proof that the tide of war was shifting. But the Marines had little time to celebrate. More enemy troops were coming. By early September, Japanese bombers from Rabaul began daily attacks on Henderson Field. The Marines nicknamed these raids Washing Machine Charlie, after the rumbling engines that haunted their nights. Every day, the Americans repaired the bombed runway, and every night, they waited for another assault. When the Cactus Air Force, a mix of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, finally arrived, the island became a fortress of determination. Flying old, patched-up Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers, these airmen fought on minimum fuel and rations, but they made every sortie count, shooting down dozens of enemy planes and sinking Japanese ships that tried to sneak through under cover of darkness. The Japanese supply route became infamous, a nighttime convoy of destroyers called the Tokyo Express. Each run brought soldiers, food, and ammunition, but never enough. The Americans began calling it the Tokyo Death Run because few of those destroyers returned unscathed. September 12, 1942. Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson and his Marines held a narrow ridge south of Henderson Field. Behind them, the airfield. In front, the jungle. That night, as darkness fell, the Japanese launched one of the fiercest assaults of the war. Thousands of soldiers screamed through the trees, their bayonets glinting in the moonlight. The Marines opened fire, tracer rounds slashing through the rain. Machine guns overheated, ammunition ran low, and the line began to buckle. Edson ran from post to post, shouting orders, rallying his men. He refused to retreat. "Hold this ridge or die on it," he shouted. By dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies carpeted the slopes. Edson's raiders had lost a third of their men, but Henderson Field still stood. For his leadership that night, Edson would later receive the Medal of Honor. While Marines fought on land, the seas around the island turned into a graveyard. Japanese cruisers and destroyers clashed with American ships in brutal night engagements. Battles fought so close, sailors could see the enemy's faces. In one of these, the Battle of Cape Esperance, U.S. ships ambushed a Japanese convoy, sinking several vessels. But for every victory, the Americans paid dearly. The waters north of the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, named for the dozens of warships now resting beneath its waves. By October, both sides were nearing exhaustion. The Marines lived on captured Japanese rice and canned food dropped by parachute. Malaria and dysentery spread through their camps. The Japanese, too, suffered, starving, sick, and demoralized. They began calling Guadalcanal Jigoku no Shima, the island of hell. Still, the Japanese refused to surrender. They launched one final desperate assault on Henderson Field in late October, known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Once again, the Marines held firm. The attack failed. The Imperial Army's dream of retaking Guadalcanal was broken forever. From that moment, Japan was no longer advancing. It was retreating. The jungle had claimed thousands of lives, but Henderson Field still stood. As the rains fell and the sea turned red, the world began to realize the empire that once seemed unstoppable was beginning to crumble. February 1943, the island of Guadalcanal lay silent. The jungle that once echoed with battle was now a graveyard of rusting guns and unburied ghosts. After 6 brutal months, the Japanese army had slipped away under the cover of darkness. For the first time in the war, Japan had retreated. And for Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had once dreamed of peace through victory, it was the beginning of his end. This is the final chapter of our story. If you've been following this journey through the Pacific War, make sure to subscribe for more powerful true stories from the tides of history. Guadalcanal had cost Japan more than just an island. It had cost them the initiative. 24,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, thousands more wounded or missing. The Imperial Navy had lost dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft. The once mighty empire was bleeding, and its enemies could smell the weakness. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was more than a victory. It was proof that the Pacific could be won. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. Every Marine, sailor, and pilot who survived that island carried with them a single truth: Japan could be beaten. Yamamoto knew it too. And though his expression remained calm before his officers, his private thoughts were heavy with regret. "A wise man wins before he fights," he once said. But we began this war already defeated. By early 1943, Japan's war machine was struggling to keep up. Fuel shortages crippled the Navy. Factories lacked steel, oil, and workers. Experienced pilots, the heart of Japan's air superiority, were gone, replaced by poorly trained rookies. Still, Yamamoto refused to surrender to despair. He believed morale could be restored through a dramatic victory, one final strike that would remind the world of Japan's power. His plan was simple yet audacious: destroy America's Pacific Air Forces on the ground and sink their ships before they could strike again. It was a gamble, and like all gamblers, Yamamoto knew the risks. But he also knew Japan's time was running out. In April 1943, Yamamoto launched Operation I-Go, a massive air offensive aimed at crippling Allied bases in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Over 350 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and attack planes prepared for battle. For days, the skies above the Pacific were ablaze. Japanese bombers struck at Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and Tulagi, while American and Australian fighters rose to meet them. Dogfights turned the clouds into chaos, machine guns flashing, engines roaring, planes spiraling into the sea. At first, the results seemed promising. Japanese pilots claimed dozens of kills and several ships sunk. But the reality was far less glorious. Most of the attacks caused little lasting damage. American losses were minimal. Japan's were devastating. Even so, Yamamoto praised his men, hoping to rekindle their fighting spirit. But his enemies were already closer than he realized. Throughout the war, Yamamoto had been a marked man. He was Japan's most brilliant strategist and its most famous. To the Americans, killing him would be a psychological blow greater than any naval victory. On April 13, 1943, U.S. intelligence intercepted a Japanese radio message. It revealed Yamamoto's exact travel schedule, his route, time of departure, and even his aircraft type. The admiral was set to visit frontline bases in the Solomon Islands to boost morale. The information was too perfect to ignore. But using it would expose a secret. The Americans had broken Japan's naval code. Still, the decision came swiftly. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the mission. It was time for Operation Vengeance. April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after the Doolittle Raid. 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal on a deadly course. Their target, a lone Mitsubishi Betty bomber carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Flying low over the jungle canopy, the P-38s intercepted their quarry near Bougainville. The sky erupted in gunfire. 2 escorting Japanese fighters were shot down. Seconds later, Yamamoto's bomber burst into flames and plunged into the dense jungle below. When Japanese search teams reached the crash site hours later, they found his body still seated upright, sword in hand, white gloves on, a bullet wound through his chest. He had died instantly, his face calm, as if asleep. The man who had once commanded the mightiest fleet in the Pacific had met his end in silence, far from home. Yamamoto's death shocked Japan. The government announced it weeks later, wrapped in ceremony and propaganda. But among those who had known him personally, there was only sorrow and understanding. He had never wanted this war. He had warned his leaders that victory against the United States was impossible. And yet, when duty called, he had fought with honor until his final breath. In Tokyo, his ashes were carried through the streets in a solemn procession. Civilians bowed, children wept, and soldiers saluted as the hearse passed. But even as they mourned, the empire he had served so faithfully was crumbling. By 1945, Japan would lie in ruins. Its cities burned, its navy gone, its emperor surrendering to the very nation Yamamoto had once tried to defeat. History remembers him as both a warrior and a prophet, a man who understood the cost of pride before the price was paid. In his final letter to a friend, he wrote, "Should I fall, it will not be for glory or fame. It will be for the peace that should have been sought before the first shot was fired." His death marked the true turning point of the Pacific War. After him, Japan would never again wage war with such confidence or such blindness. From the victory parades of Tokyo to the jungles of Guadalcanal, the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reminds us that war is not won by pride, but by wisdom. He foresaw the storm, yet was forced to sail straight into it. And though his empire rose in triumph, it fell in fire, leaving behind one man's warning, carved forever into history. This was the rise and fall of Japan's greatest admiral, the man who dreamed of peace but was bound to war. If you found this story powerful, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because history is never just about the past. From the victory parades of Tokyo to the jungles of Guadalcanal, the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reminds us that war is not won by pride, but by wisdom. He foresaw the storm, yet was forced to sail straight into it. And though his empire rose in triumph, it fell in fire, leaving behind one man's warning, carved forever into history. This was the rise and fall of Japan's greatest admiral, the man who dreamed of peace but was bound to war. If you found this story powerful, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because history is never just about the past.